The atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell was once asked if he died and discovered that God did in fact exist, what explanation would he give to God for not believing in him? And he replied emphatically, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." And I guess sentiments like that resonate with us because they beg the question, couldn't and shouldn't a God who wants us to trust him and who might hold us accountable on that basis not be a little bit more obvious about his existence so that of course we then believe? Now, one of the reasons why this question is so difficult is because obviousness is a relative term. If you were to come and visit me here in the beautiful Northern Ireland, there are some cultural faux pas or sophisticated forms of humour that would be perfectly obvious to me as a native, but wouldn't be obvious to you at all as a tourist. So what counts as obvious? How much and what kind of evidence we feel we need in order for things to be convincing depends a lot on our own particular experiences and expectations, which may not always be fair. If somebody asks me this question, I always find it helpful to ask back, well, why they don't think that God is as obvious as they would like him to be. Or sometimes I ask, what would it look like for God to be more obvious? And that helps me identify their expectations. Now, some things are not obvious because there simply isn't any evidence there. But another reason why things might not be as obvious is because we haven't been willing to consider and investigate the evidence that might be available. For example, if I was a crime scene investigator stepping into a homicide scene, I wouldn't conclude that simply because I didn't physically see the killer in the act that I couldn't come to some convincing conclusions about what actually happened. I can investigate things like forensics, motives, or where people were at the time of the killing in order to build up a cumulative case and deduce a picture of what in reality actually happened. And so my encouragement to somebody asking this question would be to gently ask, granted that you have not got the foolproof evidence that you want, how thoroughly have you investigated the evidence for God that there might still be? If I'm driving to a house that I've never been to in some remote part of Ireland that I'm completely unfamiliar with, then yes, finding it might not be very obvious. But if I've been given directions by somebody who lives there and who knows the way perfectly, and I choose to ignore them and ignore every signpost along the way, then it's not obvious for a very different reason. And when we think about our intuitive appetite for awe as we look at galaxies through telescopes, or how space, time, matter and energy came into existence out of nothing, when we reflect on how and what could account for the exquisite fine-tuning of our physical world for life, or that our complex DNA structure akins to something along the lines of language itself, it may well be that God has not left himself without a witness. The signposts might be there. God's fingerprints might be all over the scene if we're prepared to investigate. But maybe you're thinking, yes, but why wouldn't God just make it irrefutably clear by allowing us to see him physically, or by some miracle that makes it undeniable and then we'd all believe? Well, there's a couple of assumptions in statements like that. The first is to assume that mere intellectual belief in his existence is all God wants. And the other assumption is that if we got those kinds of evidences, that we definitely come to trust God. One of the reasons that God gives for why things aren't always done that way is because God is interested not simply in our intellectual belief in his existence, but in real relationship. Jesus was once asked by a group of religious leaders to perform on demand a miracle so that they would come to believe, and he refused to do so. Why? Because he knew that they weren't actually interested in trusting him. All they were interested in was testing him. And God doesn't show up to be tested. He shows up for real relationship. Because like any mutual relationship, especially ones that involve deep trust and commitment, they're often investigated over a continual process of getting to know the other person, learning about their character. And there needs to be sufficient levels of space and freedom for people to do that, so that as they look at the evidence and establish who God is and what he's like, they come to a real and informed basis for trusting him. But you can never get to know a person like that unless that person is willing to open themselves up and be revealed. And the Christian message is that God is truly open to those who are truly open to him. In many ways, the Bible is a collection of the vast stories of ways in which God has made himself known to people who would then come to trust him. And the supreme way that God has done that is by becoming human himself in the person of Jesus Christ. Because how better could God make himself knowable and accessible to human beings than by becoming one himself? And so, when we think about all of this, I find the words of Blaise Pascal very helpful. He says that when it comes to faith, there is enough evidence for those who want to see, but enough shadows for those who don't. And if you want to see God more clearly, then perhaps the best way to start and see that God might be more obvious than we think is to take a look at Jesus Christ, the supreme way that God made himself obvious. And you can do that by reading one of the biographies of his life known as the Gospels. Because one person who stands out in a history of billions is worth investigating.